Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Well, hello and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. I have entitled this podcast, Might Fit, Misfit, We Fit. Now, I just lead into that by saying, with all that we assume, explaining attraction, which could be hormones, astrology, statements like, oh, we like the same thing, so we must be compatible, or, that's like kid speak. Or, I knew you from before, and you're so cute, handsome, attractive, all of that. We hear those things, and we just assume, wow, we can have a relationship. But there's, what explains attraction to us? I know we talked about hormones and how that works, and talked about, chemistry, which, hormones kind of falls into that, and, in a big sense. But why people fit. I'm going to talk about why they will fit. Now, one of the important things is sharing the same values. Okay? And here's something, not just sharing the same values, but the definition of honesty. Now, there are so many shades to what we call honesty. And you find out in conversations with people their definition by their explanation of circumstances that they've been in. Let's say, for instance, they tell you a story about something that happened to them, and you're getting a sense of them being the character in the story and who they talk to in conversations. And you can gather from what they're telling you, each of the individuals, how they told the story to one person, and then when they repeated the story to the next person, what did they say? Was it the exact same thing? Was it things that kind of could be interpreted the same way? Or did they just flat out just change the story? You understand people better when people can tell you stories about themselves, about their life, about how they interpret things, how they understand things. Because then by having that information about them, you can see where the similarities are. And then you can share stories. And when you're trading stories back and forth, you're having that conversation, you can either agree on things or if there's slight differences, but you just understand it. And again, having a similar definition of honesty is really, really critical to finding out if you fit, if you're compatible. Because one thing I think we all have experienced in life is betrayal. And what that does it shakes you to your core when you feel like you've been betrayed, when you feel like you've been lied to. We put a lot into what people tell us. And until people do something to break our confidence in them, we tend to rely on it. And I'll tell you why that happens. As we come along in our experience of life, based on how we are raised, and I'm going to use the example of someone who's really responsible, who sets a good example, and they teach you their values. They teach you trust. So what you learn is things, people, situations. You can be very trusting. And that might sound very naive, but that's really the foundation for how we begin to believe and how we perceive things. what follows is, in life, as it will be, we then run into circumstances and situations that don't necessarily have as much integrity as the way we have seen life. And that makes us a bit cynical. And then if we see more and more circumstances are more about the sales job and all the hype rather than substance, then it teaches us to be even more cynical. So we break things down into certain categories as to how much we can trust them and those that we simply cannot trust. But it's usually through some sort of experience that gives us that. And when it comes to dealing with individuals and people, we generally start out being very trusting until we become more of the other extreme, very cynical. And then we force the person or the circumstance to really work hard to earn our trust. Now, a lot of people feel that I don't trust anybody until they prove they're worthy. I get that. I understand that. But as we're talking about relationships here and finding out about the compatibility, one of the things we have to do is, from time to time, take a leap of faith. When you learn something about yourself in terms of cynicism, then if remembering your own story and how we put that on top of the new experiences we have can go a long way to helping you decipher what to do in the future. Counselors are really good at this. I'm not saying everybody needs counseling. I know I promote that as a way of having your own space, a safe space to work through some of these things. But I'm talking about how we get to this place. And how we get there is through our own experience in life. And then as we analyze what happens to us, because usually it's something in the way when we start experiencing a lot of loss that gives us those moments to, okay, I need to pause and find out what's going on here. Well, as you think about your life and how these circumstances build up, you then create this filter with which you look at situations and circumstances, people, episodes in the world, and blah, 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 blah. So if you find yourself feeling as though you have a hard time letting go of your cynicism, this could be part of the reason. It's one of the building blocks in your foundation. And you have to go to those particular building blocks and say, okay, I'm going to just take a pause with that for a minute. And I'm going to take a leap of faith and give something an opportunity to have a different outcome rather than me, what I call, project into this. Because cynicism is what it is, and it's a self-protect mechanism. It's not, in my experience, something that people just want to do because they can't think of anything else. You really have to think of what's that person's experience been that they become that. Because everybody doesn't start out being cynical. It's an experience that winds up repeating itself, meaning the negative experience repeats itself over and over, and it kicks in as a self-protect mechanism. I firmly believe that. And when you know that, then you can do something about it. Meaning you can wind up changing the outcome of your experiences when you realize how you are projecting onto these experiences. And why is this important? Well, it's important because as I talked about definition of honesty and relating to people, you could probably wind up relating to more people if you knew how to check your negative impulses. Looking to, and let's say you are somebody who wants to meet people, who wants to connect with people, but you find it very, very difficult. I think that if you look at how you project onto situations, and you may need help with that particular thing, and this is why I mentioned the counselor, somebody who's objective, But when you get some help with that, I think you can then begin to change the outcome of those relationships. I'm going to take a break, and I'll be right back after this.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm John Johnson, talking about might fit, misfit, we fit. Now, at the end of that last segment, one of the things that I had started out in terms of classification is why we fit, and I got into the definition of honesty and how it's definitely one of those things it's in layers, and about how you listen to a person, find out from the description of how they talk about themselves and the experiences, and to see where your similarities are. And then I went off and started explaining something in the way of the cynicism and why some people have a challenge or have trouble with the honesty of other individuals. And, you know, it's in varying degrees, but some people don't have a problem with it. Some people have a huge problem with it. And it's kind of like when I start talking about maybe the issue of trust, and why we start out being very trusting because we are in the care of people who love us, who look out for us, and wouldn't ever let us down. And then as we move into the world, we begin to experience things that don't have the same kind of integrity. And that experience tends to repeat itself more and more often. And we learn how we buy into the sales pitch of things, people, anything in that regard. And it makes us more and more cynical. So that's how, cynicism, one of its roots and why it becomes more pervasive. And also when it comes to dealing with people and why you communicate with them is, you want to find out what your similarities are. And when we're talking about relationships and who we're compatible with, oftentimes we get snowed by the chemistry. And I mentioned early on, I made a reference to, people get in the sideshow, they talk about, there's the hormones, because people get driven because they feel like they want to mate. They want to be with somebody, and they don't even really do much of an interview to find out something about the person they're attracted to. And, some people are into astrology. So they figure they're going to meet somebody of a particular sign because they read about that, the characteristics, the traits of that individual. And they say, wow, that's somebody who's interesting. And I've been told that my sign matches that sign. And so I'm going to have to find somebody like that. That could be very interesting. It's very, like I said, it's interesting to follow something like that. And we can probably find truth in anything we invest in, some truth. But we do have to have some objectivity when we're talking about human beings. There's also the thing called free will. So, yeah, the astrology thing may work for a while, but, every person is an individual and they wake up feeling a different way every morning. Then that certainly could be explained in the astrology, and it may not be. It could be explained in the chemistry and it may not be. And, the chemistry thing could be something that, after the honeymoon wears off, then maybe there's no more chemistry. And when I'm talking about honeymoon, every relationship has a honeymoon period. And we talk about that from time to time, is when the honeymoon period is when nothing could go wrong. We're just happy with each other. We're loving. We're attentive. We're all of that. And then when we reach a certain stage where we begin to relax and not on our quote unquote best behavior, then the other side starts to show up. And it could be maybe the shortness of temper. And that falls under the might fit category. Why? Because when you start to see those aspects of an individual, how attractive is that? Well, if it's authentic, then you may determine, hey, I've seen that before. I can handle that. I mean, it's definitely different from what I described when you're in the honeymoon phase. But when you're realistic about how people aren't always happy to see you. They're glad that you're around, but there are times that you're going to be there and it's just not going to be convenient for them to have to put on the happy face, especially when they're feeling something different inside. And they don't necessarily want to hide it from you, because when you're being authentic, then you're sharing the good and the maybe not so good. How many people are really prepared to deal with that? Most people aren't really early on, because they see that as a sign of worse things to follow. And maybe it is. I think you have to spend time with a person to really figure out, is this a blip on the scope, or is this sort of part of the downhill slide that happens when you feel like, wow, this might be a toxic person. Those are all things to keep in mind. But I definitely believe that people being authentic that's what you want. And you find out those things by spending time having thoughtful conversations with them. When I say thoughtful, authentic conversations, and then that means you put a lot of thought into it. Because there are questions that you can ask somebody that the only answer is an answer that's going to make everybody happy and smile, and you almost telegraph what the right answer is, so to speak. And you know what I mean? When you ask a question, if they say the wrong answer, they know that they're going to get they're going to get the rejection. So they know what the answer is, but you want to ask open-ended questions. The kinds of questions that say, what are you about? Tell me about yourself. That's an open-ended question. Now, then they ask you about, well, what do you want to know about? Okay, well, I want to know about your family. And let them speak. And as they're sharing their story with you, there may be things about their story and their family that resonate. Now, they don't have to be necessarily really articulate about it. Some people are not very good in terms of sharing the details. And I don't mean that they're cagey about it. I mean, as far as their language, they might not be very fancy about it. They may not talk about it in the way that seems really smooth and polished. But that's okay, because what you want to be able to feel them out about is who they are. What kind of relationships do they have with their family? Is it something that you feel connected to, something that you feel drawn to, something that makes you feel warm, and that if you were to be around that person, would you feel loved and cared about? Those are the kind of things that you want to know about. And I put that under the might fit, because it's open-ended. You have to determine if this is something that really works for you. And what I find more often, especially early on in conversations, and it's just more of not having the skill to do it, but it's asking the critical thinking questions, asking the open-ended questions so that people have to answer them. And when they don't answer, when they're holding stuff back, then that might be reason to pause. And again, I put that under the might fit classification. So think about yourself. If you had something that you wanted to share with somebody, something that might be very personal, a little more revealing, you'd also want to know how that person is going to treat that information. Are they going to treat it with care and concern and like you would want them to, or are they the kind of person that's going to throw it back at you at some point in time, use it as leverage? I would hope not, because if you are speaking to a person that would do that kind of thing, that's not a person that you can feel safe with. I'm going to take another pause, and I'll be right back after this.
The GSMC Sex Podcast is a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet. Download the GSMC Sex Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you can find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Hello and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm going to talk about might fit, misfit, we fit. Now, on the might fit part, here's something that I want to introduce in terms of, well, it's obviously something that you want to consider. It's beliefs about money and raising children. See, these are all really, really important things to think about when, let's say you're starting out in a relationship with somebody and you want to determine if this is going to be a life partner. Because the children, the money, those are two huge things that come up in relationships. Children and money, how you raise them in terms of children, and your value, your relationship with money. Quite often, you have relationships that have a bit of a mismatch, and people don't necessarily find out these things about their love interest until well after they've got a lot invested. And it can be a source of friction where you both have to learn some compromise. But there are some things that would be really, really difficult to compromise on. But people manage to do so. We're human beings, so we manage to coexist. But when it comes to, let's say, child rearing, and we all have our experience with things that we would like to see for our kids. And I think most people want to see the best for their children. And as children are being exposed to the world, as they are growing, their response to situations, circumstances, the upbringing, from their parents, the teaching the rights and the wrongs. And when they do right, do you praise your kids? How do you do that? There's lots of philosophy on that. Some people are really big and they clap and make big productions about it, and some people don't. Now, whether it's a part of their belief system or as a parent you're too tired to do it, there could be lots of reasons why the don'ts don't happen. But when it comes to how you want your child to experience the world, remember, you as a parent, you shape that. You have the power. You have the control. You create circumstances in which you praise your kids, and when the kids don't do something or when they do something that you don't like, then you have to correct them. You discipline them. And there are lots of ways to do that. And it's important that you and your significant other have conversations about those kinds of things. And I think and if you go back to the other part of the podcast when I was talking about your family values, how you were raised, the experiences that you had, conversations like that will come up. Maybe not so much in a direct form of, how do you raise kids, but when you talk about your experience, how did your parents discipline you? What were the chores that you had to do when you were a kid? Those kinds of things really tell you a lot about an individual. And I'm talking about when it will fit, people are very closely aligned. The families probably knew each other. I mean, it can almost seem like, well, there was, this is some parents say, well, our kids are going to get married when they get older, almost like an arranged sort of thing. And then there's the love interests that just show up from different sides of the country, and they meet and find out there's a lot of compatibilities. So that even comes more like the we fit, but it's kind of a might fit because you have to work out some of the things. Now, I'm going to transition to the don't fits. It's not that it won't ever happen, but it has more of the tension and the friction of relationships. But, some people are really turned on by that. You've heard the expression opposites attract. Well, it happens. And some people tend to find those opposites, meaning they're attracted to someone who has a skill or something like that you don't have. So it almost feels like the yin and the yang. If you've seen that symbol, it's like a circle, and think of like a raindrop that's sort of leaning over, and there's like an eye. There's an eye in the middle of each one of the raindrops, but they sort of fill the inside of the circle together, and they're connected by the fact that they have a similar adjacent sides to them. So some people are very attracted to someone who is different, totally different than them. And what I have heard people talk about, what I've talked about with people, is that when they have been around individuals that are so similar to them, it seems very dull, very mundane, very routine, and there's nothing exciting. It's boring. It's nothing interesting in that. But to be around people who are different, that gives you a different experience of the world, well, that's exciting. That's attractive. And that could be a really, really strong draw. That might fall under, the misfit as much as the won't fit kind of thing. I mean, the won't fit sounds like, okay, this will never work. Well, on the outside, it just seems like it's going to clash. But it really takes work on the individuals to hold together. The struggle sometimes really brings people closer and closer together. I mean, you've heard of that when people have had to endure a similar type of a hardship, maybe a natural disaster, and they find that they were put in very similar circumstances. They've had to struggle. They've had to depend on each other to survive whatever it is, whatever circumstance that came about. It's very stressful, but you learn a lot about people in those situations. And you may come across someone who really stands out as having a lot of smarts, a lot of intestinal fortitude, meaning they're really strong. They can handle crises or stress. And that's really comforting to a lot of people, because when you've been around situations that you don't necessarily know how to handle, but you're around someone that does, it's like having an authority figure, somebody you can rely on. Those are really... Those seem like people that you can put in your foundation, your rock. You can grow on that. And those kinds of individuals are attractive to us because we feel like we can rely on them, that they will always be there. So situations really make a difference for people. Communicating who you are, what you're about, being a good listener, getting questions answered, asking open-ended questions, critical thinking all the time. I think that's really important. Being willing to be vulnerable and share about who you are, what you're about, what you want, knowing something about what you want. All of this is critical when it comes to finding somebody who can be of value, who can be added value to your life, and somebody that you can, complement them as well. Might fit, misfit, we fit. I'm John Johnson. Thank you for listening.